New York City, November 1898. The gas lamps flickered against the early evening fog as carriages clattered over cobblestone streets, their wheels echoing through the narrow alleys of Little Italy. Steam rose from the manholes where the new underground pipes carried heat through the growing metropolis. The smell of coal smoke and horse manure mixed with the aroma of fresh bread from the bakeries that lined Mulberry Street. Margaret O'Sullivan pressed her threadbare shawl closer to her shoulders as she walked along the sidewalk, her worn boots making soft sounds against the wet pavement. She had not eaten in 2 days, and the gnawing hunger in her stomach reminded her of how far she had fallen since losing her job at the textile factory 6 months ago. The economic panic of 1896 still cast its shadow over the working class, and jobs remained scarce for women without family connections. She paused near a lamppost, watching well-dressed gentlemen in their wool overcoats and top hats enter Romano's restaurant, their gold pocket watches gleaming in the gaslight. The establishment was known throughout the neighborhood as a place where important business was conducted, though few spoke openly about the nature of that business. As Margaret turned to continue her evening search for discarded food or loose coins, something caught her eye on the ground near the restaurant's entrance. A leather wallet, thick with what appeared to be paper money, lay partially hidden beneath a newspaper that had been blown against the building's brick wall. She looked around quickly, noting the few pedestrians hurrying past with their heads down against the cold November wind. No one seemed to have noticed the dropped wallet. Margaret's heart raced as she considered her options. The money inside could feed her for weeks, perhaps even allow her to rent a small room again instead of sleeping in the doorways of closed shops. But her mother's voice echoed in her memory, speaking the words she had repeated throughout Margaret's childhood in their small tenement apartment. Honesty is the only treasure that remains when all else is lost. My dear girl. Margaret bent down and picked up the wallet, feeling its weight in her cold hands. The leather was fine quality, probably Italian, with initials embossed in gold. VR. She opened it carefully and gasped at the sight of more money than she had ever seen in one place. There were several $20 bills, along with 10s and 5s, all crisp and new. Tucked behind the money was a small card with an address on Elizabeth Street, along with what appeared to be a business card for an import company. Margaret studied the name printed in elegant script. Vincent Romano, Romano Import Company. She closed the wallet and looked up at the restaurant's entrance, where a doorman in a dark suit stood watching the street with sharp eyes. Margaret had heard whispers about the Romano family in the neighborhood. They were said to be powerful men who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Some called them businessmen. Others used different words when they thought no one was listening. Taking a deep breath, Margaret straightened her shoulders and approached the restaurant's entrance. The doorman stepped forward, his expression changing from neutral to suspicious as he took in her shabby dress and worn shoes. "I beg your pardon, sir," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I believe someone dropped this outside." She held up the wallet, and the doorman's eyes widened slightly as he recognized it. Without a word, the man disappeared inside the restaurant, leaving Margaret standing on the sidewalk clutching the wallet. Within moments, he returned with a tall, broad-shouldered man whose dark hair was perfectly groomed and whose expensive suit marked him as someone of considerable means. His eyes were the color of dark coffee, and they studied Margaret with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her soul. "You found my wallet," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that suggested Italian heritage mixed with years of American life. "Yes, sir. It was on the ground near the lamppost," Margaret replied, extending the wallet toward him. Vincent Romano took the wallet and opened it, his fingers quickly counting the bills inside. Margaret watched his face, noting the way his expression shifted from suspicion to something that might have been surprise. "Everything appears to be here," he said, looking up at her again. "That is unusual in this neighborhood. I would not take what does not belong to me, sir," Margaret said quietly. Vincent continued to study her face, taking in the hollow cheeks that spoke of hunger, the careful way she held herself despite her obvious poverty, and the dignity that somehow remained intact despite her circumstances. He reached into the wallet and pulled out a $5 bill. "For your honesty," he said, offering her the money. Margaret shook her head. "Thank you, sir, but I did nothing that deserves payment." I simply returned what was yours. This response seemed to surprise Vincent even more than her initial act of honesty. He slowly returned the money to his wallet, never taking his eyes off her face. "What is your name?" he asked. "Margaret O'Sullivan, sir." "Well, Miss O'Sullivan, you have done me a service tonight. If you ever find yourself in need of assistance, you can find me here most evenings." Margaret nodded politely and turned to walk away, not noticing that Vincent Romano remained standing in the doorway, watching her figure disappear into the fog-shrouded street. 3 days had passed since Margaret returned the wallet, and Vincent Romano found himself thinking about the homeless woman more often than he cared to admit. As he sat in his private office above Romano's restaurant, reviewing the ledgers for his legitimate import business, her face kept appearing in his mind. There had been something about her quiet dignity that had unsettled him in a way he could not quite understand. Vincent had built his reputation on reading people correctly. In his line of work, the ability to determine who could be trusted and who posed a threat often meant the difference between life and death. Yet Margaret O'Sullivan had presented him with something entirely unexpected: genuine honesty without any apparent motive for personal gain. He closed the leather-bound ledger and walked to the window overlooking Mulberry Street. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones, and vendors were beginning to pack up their carts for the day. Street children ran between the carriages, dodging horses and shouting to one another in a mixture of English and Italian. "Antonio!" he called to his lieutenant, who stood near the door. A stocky man with greying hair stepped forward. Antonio Benedetti had served the Romano family for 15 years, first Vincent's father, and now Vincent himself. His loyalty was absolute, and his discretion was legendary throughout Little Italy. "Yes, Don Romano, I want you to find someone for me, a woman named Margaret O'Sullivan. Irish, probably in her 20s. She has been living on the streets for some time." Antonio raised an eyebrow, but asked no questions. He had learned long ago that Vincent's requests were not to be questioned, only fulfilled. "What would you like me to do when I find her?" "Simply keep watch. I want to know where she goes, what she does, who she speaks with. But she must not know she is being observed." "Of course, Don Romano." That evening, as Vincent conducted his usual business meetings in the private dining room of his restaurant, Antonio returned with his first report. "I found her, sir. She spends most of her time near the docks, looking for work. The foremen tell me she asks about any job available, no matter how difficult or poorly paid. When there is no work, she searches for discarded items that might be sold or traded for food." Vincent nodded, continuing to cut his veal as if the conversation were about nothing more significant than the weather. "Where does she sleep?" "Different places each night, sometimes in the doorway of O'Brien's bakery on Hester Street, sometimes near the church on Mott Street. She moves frequently, probably to avoid trouble with the police or other vagrants." "Continue watching her," Vincent said, "but be careful. She seems observant." Over the following week, Antonio provided daily reports about Margaret's activities. She maintained the same routine, searching for work during the day, finding shelter where she could at night, and never taking anything that did not belong to her, even when the opportunity presented itself. On Tuesday, Antonio reported that she had found a day's work helping an elderly woman clean her apartment. Margaret had refused payment beyond a simple meal, insisting that the woman needed her money more than she did. On Wednesday, she had returned a lost dog to its owner, a wealthy merchant who had offered her a substantial reward. She had accepted only enough money for a single meal, claiming that returning the dog was simply the right thing to do. By Friday, Vincent found himself walking the streets of the Lower East Side in the early evening, keeping to the shadows as he observed Margaret from a distance. She was sitting on the steps of St. Patrick's Old Cathedral, sharing a piece of bread with another homeless woman who appeared to be ill. Vincent watched as Margaret gave the larger portion to her companion, keeping only a small piece for herself. Even from across the street, he could see the care with which she tended to the other woman, adjusting her shawl and speaking to her in quiet, comforting tones. As darkness fell, Margaret helped the sick woman to a sheltered doorway, ensuring she was as comfortable as possible before finding her own place to rest for the night. Vincent remained in the shadows until he was certain both women were settled, then made his way back to Little Italy. The next morning, Vincent sent Antonio to make discreet inquiries about Margaret's background. What he learned only deepened his fascination with the mysterious Irish woman who had returned his wallet without expecting anything in return. Margaret O'Sullivan had indeed worked at the Crawford textile factory until its closure earlier that year, Her supervisors remembered her as reliable and honest, never missing a day of work, despite the dangerous conditions and meager pay. When the factory closed, she had used her small savings to pay her landlord and help other tenement families who had also lost their jobs. She could have kept that money for herself, Antonio reported. Instead, she made sure families with children had food and rent money. When her own savings ran out, she was evicted from her apartment. Vincent sat in silence for a long time after hearing this report. In his world, such selflessness was not just rare, it was virtually unknown. Men and women acted out of self-interest, loyalty born of fear, or the hope of future rewards. Margaret O'Sullivan seemed to operate according to an entirely different set of principles. That evening, as Vincent stood once again in the shadows watching Margaret settle down for the night in a doorway near the East River, he made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. He would continue watching her, but not from a distance. Tomorrow, he would find a way to enter her world more directly, to understand what drove this remarkable woman who seemed untouched by the corruption and greed that surrounded her in the harsh streets of New York City the morning fog rolled in from New York Harbor as Margaret made her way toward the docks, hoping to find work loading or unloading the merchant ships that arrived daily from Europe. The November air was bitter cold, and her breath formed small clouds as she walked along South Street, where the tall masts of sailing vessels created a forest of wood and rope against the grey sky. She had not eaten in nearly 2 days, and the weakness in her legs reminded her of how desperate her situation had become. The winter months were approaching, and she knew that her chances of surviving on the streets would diminish with each passing week. As she approached the hiring area, where dock foremen selected their daily workers, Margaret noticed a commotion near one of the larger cargo ships. A group of longshoremen had gathered around something on the ground, their voices raised in concern. Pushing through the crowd, Margaret saw an elderly man lying unconscious on the wooden pier, his face pale and his breathing shallow. Blood trickled from a wound on his forehead, suggesting he had fallen and struck his head on the dock's planking. "Someone should fetch a doctor," one of the workers said, but no one moved to leave the circle. "Doctors cost money, and who is going to pay for it?" another man replied. "Besides, look at his clothes. He is probably just another vagrant who wandered onto the docks." Margaret knelt beside the injured man, gently lifting his head to examine the wound. She had learned basic medical care from her mother, who had worked as a seamstress, but often helped neighbors with injuries and illnesses in their tenement building. "He needs immediate attention," she said, looking up at the gathered men. "This wound must be cleaned, or it will become infected." "And what do you know about doctoring?" one of the longshoremen asked with a laugh. "You are just a homeless woman yourself." Margaret ignored the comment and began tearing strips from her petticoat to make bandages. She used water from a nearby rain barrel to clean the wound, working with gentle but sure movements while the man remained unconscious. From across the pier, Vincent Romano watched the scene unfold. He had arrived at the docks to oversee a shipment arriving from Sicily, but his attention had been captured entirely by Margaret's actions. He could see the care with which she tended to the stranger, the way she ignored the mockery of the dock workers, and the skill with which she treated his injuries. "Don Romano," Antonio whispered beside him. "Should we intervene?" "Not yet," Vincent replied, continuing to observe. As Margaret worked, the injured man's eyes fluttered open. He appeared to be in his 60s, with grey hair and the weathered hands of someone who had worked hard his entire life. His eyes focused on Margaret's face with confusion and gratitude. "Easy now," Margaret said softly. "You have had a fall, but you are going to be all right." The man tried to sit up, but Margaret placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Rest for a moment. Let me finish bandaging your head. I cannot pay you for this," the man whispered, his voice barely audible above the sounds of the busy port. "I am not asking for payment," Margaret replied, securing the makeshift bandage. "Everyone deserves help when they are hurt." As she helped the man to his feet, Vincent stepped forward from the shadows where he had been watching. The crowd of longshoremen immediately recognized him and stepped back respectfully, their earlier crude comments dying on their lips. "Miss O'Sullivan," Vincent said, as if their meeting was entirely coincidental. "I see you are providing assistance to this gentleman." Margaret looked up, surprise flickering across her face as she recognized the well-dressed man from the restaurant. "Mr. Romano, yes, this man fell and injured his head. He needs proper medical attention." Vincent studied the injured man, taking note of his shabby clothes and the calluses on his hands that marked him as a labourer. In the normal course of business, such a person would be beneath Vincent's notice, but Margaret's care for the stranger had somehow made him significant. "Giuseppe," Vincent called to one of his men, who was supervising the cargo unloading. "Take this man to Dr. Castellano on Mott Street. Tell the doctor that Vincent Romano sent him, and that all expenses are to be charged to my account." The injured man's eyes widened with shock and gratitude, but he was too weak to protest as Giuseppe helped him toward a waiting carriage. Margaret watched the carriage pull away, then turned to Vincent with a puzzled expression. "That was very kind of you, Mr. Romano, but it was not necessary. I'm sure he would have managed somehow." "Perhaps," Vincent replied, "but you were correct that he needed proper medical care. A head injury can be dangerous if not treated by someone with proper training." "Thank you," Margaret said quietly. "He seemed like a good man who has simply fallen on hard times." Vincent found himself studying her face again, noting the way her eyes followed the carriage until it disappeared into the maze of streets leading away from the docks. Even in her own desperate circumstances, she showed more concern for a stranger's welfare than most people showed for their own families. "Miss O'Sullivan," he said carefully, "I have been wondering about something since the night you returned my wallet. You mentioned that you would not take what does not belong to you, yet you must face considerable hardship living on the streets. Do you never feel tempted to bend those principles when survival is at stake?" Margaret considered his question seriously before answering. "My mother used to tell me that our principles are tested most severely when following them costs us the most. If I abandoned my beliefs simply because life became difficult, then they were never truly my beliefs at all." Vincent felt something stir within his chest that he had not experienced in many years. In his world of violence, intimidation, and constant calculation of advantage, Margaret O'Sullivan represented something he had thought no longer existed: genuine goodness that asked for nothing in return. As they stood facing each other on the busy pier, with cargo ships unloading their goods and dock workers calling to one another in multiple languages, Vincent made a decision that would bind their fates together in ways neither of them could yet imagine. "Miss O'Sullivan," Vincent said, his voice carrying a formality that seemed to weigh each word carefully, "I have a proposition for you." Margaret tilted her head slightly, her green eyes showing both curiosity and caution. Around them, the dock workers continued their labour, loading and unloading cargo from the ships that had arrived on the morning tide, the smell of salt air mixed with coal smoke and the various spices being transported from distant lands. "I am listening." "Mr. Romano," Vincent gestured toward a quieter section of the pier, away from the bustle of workers and the noise of steam-powered cranes. As they walked, Margaret noticed how the other men on the docks stepped aside respectfully when Vincent passed, their eyes downcast in a way that suggested both fear and reverence. "I have been observing your character since the night you returned my wallet," Vincent began, choosing his words with the precision of a man accustomed to negotiations, where a single misspoken word could have deadly consequences. "You possess qualities that are rare in this city, perhaps rare anywhere in these modern times." "I do not understand what you mean, sir." Vincent stopped walking and turned to face her directly. "Honesty, compassion, integrity. These are not common traits among people who know the streets as you do. Most individuals in your circumstances would have taken that wallet and disappeared into the night. Instead, you returned it without hesitation." Margaret shifted uncomfortably under his intense gaze. "As I told you before, I simply did what was right." "Precisely." Vincent's voice carried a note of satisfaction, as if she had confirmed something he had hoped to hear. "You did what was right, not what was profitable or convenient. That kind of moral certainty is valuable to a man in my position." A chill wind blew across the harbour, and Margaret pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. Vincent noticed the gesture and the way she suppressed a shiver despite her efforts to maintain her dignity. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Romano?" "I need someone I can trust completely," Vincent said. "Someone whose loyalty cannot be bought or compromised. Someone who will tell me the truth regardless of whether it is what I want to hear. In exchange, I am prepared to offer you employment, proper housing and security." Margaret's eyes widened slightly. After months of struggling to find even temporary work, the offer seemed almost too good to be true. Yet something in Vincent's manner suggested that this opportunity would come with complications she could not yet foresee. "What type of employment?" she asked carefully. I own several legitimate businesses in addition to the restaurant, Vincent replied, which was true, though he made no mention of his less legitimate enterprises. I need someone to manage household affairs, correspond with business associates, and serve as a companion to my younger sister, who has recently arrived from Sicily. She speaks little English and would benefit from the company of a respectable woman. Vincent watched Margaret's face as he spoke, noting the way her expression shifted from suspicion to cautious interest. He had crafted this explanation carefully, providing enough truth to be believable, while omitting the more dangerous aspects of what her position might eventually entail. Your sister, Margaret repeated thoughtfully. How old is she? 17. Her name is Lucia, and she has been sheltered her entire life. Our father felt it was time for her to join me in America, but the transition has been difficult. She needs guidance from someone who understands what it means to face hardship with grace. This detail seemed to resonate with Margaret in a way Vincent had hoped it would. Her expression softened, and he could see her imagining herself in the role of protector and guide to a young woman far from home. Where would I live? Margaret asked. I own a house on Elizabeth Street. It is respectable and safe, with proper accommodations for household staff. You would have your own room, regular meals, and appropriate clothing for your position. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, watching a merchant ship navigate toward its berth, while workers prepared to secure its mooring lines. Vincent waited patiently, understanding that she was weighing not just the practical benefits of his offer, but the moral implications of accepting charity from a man whose reputation preceded him throughout the neighborhood. Mr. Romano, she said finally, I appreciate your generosity, but I must ask you directly, what is the true nature of your business interests? Vincent felt a moment of admiration for her directness. Most people who suspected the truth about his activities were too frightened to voice their concerns so openly. Her courage in asking the question confirmed his assessment of her character. I import goods from Italy and other parts of Europe, he replied carefully. I also have interests in several restaurants and provide protection services to business owners in this neighborhood who face difficulties with competitors or troublemakers. It was an artful explanation that revealed nothing while implying everything. Margaret studied his face, and Vincent could see her intelligence working to decode his words. I see, she said quietly. And you believe I would be suitable for such an environment? I believe you would bring a moral perspective that is currently lacking in my household, Vincent replied honestly. My sister needs guidance from someone who has not been corrupted by the harsh realities of business and survival in this city. You have maintained your principles despite facing those same harsh realities yourself. Margaret looked down at her worn boots and shabby dress, then back up at Vincent's expensive suit and confident bearing. The contrast between their stations in life could hardly have been greater, yet he was offering to bridge that gap with an opportunity that seemed almost miraculous. If I were to accept your offer, she said slowly, I would need your assurance that I would never be asked to do anything that contradicts my moral beliefs. Vincent extended his hand toward her, palm upward, in a gesture that seemed both formal and strangely intimate. You have my word, Miss O'Sullivan. Your conscience will remain your own. Margaret hesitated for only a moment before placing her hand in his, sealing an agreement that would transform both of their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. 3 months had passed since Margaret O'Sullivan had accepted Vincent Romano's offer, and the transformation in her life seemed almost like a dream from which she might wake at any moment. The house on Elizabeth Street was indeed respectable, a 3-story brownstone with gas lighting, indoor plumbing, and furnishings that spoke of both wealth and refined taste. Margaret's room on the 2nd floor overlooked a small garden where Lucia Romano spent her mornings tending to the flowers and herbs she had planted, to remind her of their family's estate in Sicily. The young woman had indeed been sheltered, but Margaret had discovered that beneath her shy exterior lay an intelligent and compassionate spirit that responded well to gentle guidance. Margaret, Lucia called from the garden in her accented English, which had improved dramatically over the past months. Come see what has bloomed today. Margaret set aside the correspondence she had been organizing for Vincent's import business and joined Lucia outside. The March air was crisp but carried the promise of spring, and the small garden showed the first signs of new growth after the harsh winter. The roses are beginning to bud, Lucia said. pointing to the carefully pruned bushes along the garden's eastern wall. In Sicily, they would have been blooming for weeks already, but here they must wait for winter to release its hold. Margaret nodded, understanding that Lucia was speaking about more than flowers. The young woman's adjustment to life in America had been gradual, marked by moments of homesickness and uncertainty, but she had shown remarkable resilience in adapting to her new circumstances. "Your English has become quite excellent," Margaret observed. "Soon you will not need my help with your correspondence at all. But I hope you will stay anyway," Lucia said quickly. "You have become like a sister to me, and Vincent says that your presence has brought peace to our household." Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest at these words. Over the past months, she had indeed found a sense of purpose and belonging that she had not experienced since her mother's death years earlier. Vincent had kept his word about respecting her moral boundaries, and she had never been asked to participate in or overlook anything that troubled her conscience. The front door of the house opened, and Vincent appeared in the garden. He had removed his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, a rare sight that suggested he had been working in his study rather than conducting his usual business meetings. "Good afternoon, ladies," he said, his formal tone softening, as it always did when he spoke to his sister and Margaret. "I hope you are enjoying this fine weather." "Margaret was just telling me how well my English has progressed," Lucia replied. "Perhaps soon I will be able to help with the business correspondence as she does." Vincent's eyes met Margaret's, and she saw something there that had been growing stronger over the past weeks. What had begun as respect for her character had evolved into something deeper and more complex. Margaret felt her own heart respond to that look, despite her efforts to maintain appropriate boundaries between employer and employee. "Actually," Vincent said, "I wanted to speak with both of you about a change in our arrangements." Margaret felt a sudden chill of concern. Had she somehow disappointed him? Had he discovered something about her background that made her unsuitable for her position? "What kind of change?" Lucia asked, moving closer to Margaret in an instinctive gesture of protection. Vincent smiled at his sister's reaction, then looked directly at Margaret. "I have been thinking about our conversation on the docks, when you spoke about principles being tested when following them costs us the most. Over these past months, I have watched you maintain those principles while bringing something to this household that I had not realized was missing." He paused, seeming to choose his words with even greater care than usual. "Margaret, you have shown my sister what it means to be a woman of strength and compassion. You have organized my legitimate business affairs with an efficiency I could not have imagined. Most importantly, you have brought a sense of honor to this house that has reminded me of who I wanted to be before life forced me to become someone else." Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. Vincent's words carried an emotional weight that went far beyond the simple acknowledgement of good service. "What I am trying to say," Vincent continued, "is that I would like to ask you to consider staying permanently, not as an employee, but as a member of this family." Lucia clapped her hands together with delight, but Margaret stood frozen, understanding the full implications of what Vincent was suggesting. "Vincent," she said quietly, "your world and mine are very different. The choices you have made, the life you lead, has been shaped by necessity and survival," Vincent replied. "But you have shown me that there is another way to live, another way to conduct business, another way to be a man worthy of respect, rather than merely feared." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, causing Lucia to gasp with excitement, and Margaret's heart to race with a mixture of joy and terror. "Margaret O'Sullivan," Vincent said, dropping to one knee in the small garden as the spring afternoon light filtered through the budding trees. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Margaret looked down at this powerful man kneeling before her, offering her not just love, but the chance to help him become the person his better nature wanted him to be. She thought of the wallet she had returned months earlier, the simple act of honesty that had led to this moment, and her mother's words about principles being tested when following them cost the most. This time, following her principles would not cost her everything. Instead, it would give her a chance at the kind of life she had never dared to dream possible. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Vincent Romano, I will marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, and Lucia cheered with happiness, Margaret realized that sometimes the greatest rewards come not from abandoning one's principles, but from holding to them so firmly that they transform not only ourselves, but everyone whose lives we touch. In the distance, The bells of St. Patrick's Old Cathedral began to ring, marking the end of another day in the great city of New York, where a homeless woman's act of simple honesty had grown into a love story that would change two lives forever.